everyone for tuning in to our webinar series on fire retardancy. My name is Andrew Blum. I'll be serving as your moderator and host today. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to tell you a little bit about this webinar series. This webinar series evolved from member requests to the staff at the Industrial Fabrics Association, as did the topical outline shown here on the left. The plan is to cover the topics in a series of webinars held approximately every 2 months. The topical outline and the schedule will continue to evolve based on member and participant feedback and requests. So please keep the feedback and comments coming as we move through this series. Today we are pleased to present our third webinar in the series with an overview of the performance standards for industrial textiles. On February 23rd, Alex Morgan and I will deliver a webinar on testing textiles for fire retardancy. Future dates and specific topics are still to be determined, but as I mentioned, the tentative plan right now is to schedule a webinar about every 2 months until we get through all of these topics. So let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Marcelo Hirschler has specialized in fire issues for over 30 years with a background in academia and industry. From 1984 to 1991, he managed the Fire Testing and Research Laboratory at B.F. Goodrich. He has published some 500 papers and 5 books, including The Combustion of Organic Polymers, Fire Hazard and Fire Risk Assessment, and Fire Calorimetry. And he served on the editorial board of several scientific fire journals, including the Journal of Fire Sciences and the Fire Safety Journal. He is a very active member in developing fire standards and codes, both nationally and internationally, which makes him a perfect speaker for today's webinar. Please note that if you have a question during the webinar, enter it into the GoToWebinar toolbar. We will address those questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, Marcelo, I turn it over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Industrial Fabrics for inviting me to speak. I want to talk about what the requirements are that the products that you manufacture have to meet in terms of fire safety. Talk about codes and regulations. Oh, hey, I don't have control. Excuse me, Andrew? Can't move the slides.
Okay.
You have to click on the screen one time.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, first of all, I looked at the website of IFAI and looked at the type of industrial fabrics that are involved, and you probably know, well, you certainly know a lot more than I do about, but these are the type of fabrics that I think would apply. Of course, in every case, not every fabric of that type would be an industrial fabric, but I think in all of these categories there are industrial fabrics that would apply. Requirements can be at the federal level, and they are primarily by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. There are also requirements by transportation agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Coast Guard, Federal Railroad Administration, and others. Required for individual states, primarily California. There's also some requirements in some of the other states, particularly, for example, in the city of Boston. There are requirements in the codes, and I'll explain the difference between requirements from regulation and requirements from codes. The 4 codes that are of particular importance are the International Building Code, International Fire Code, NFPA 101 Life Safety Code, NFPA 5000 Building Code. Then there are specifications, although there's no requirements. If you sell something and someone specifies that you have to meet whatever it is that they want you to meet, that's a requirement for you. And then internationally, I think the only one that probably applies is the International Maritime Organization for Fabrics in the marine world. These gives you the cover sheets of the major codes from the ICC, International Code Council. You see starting at the top, International Building Code, Fire Code, Residential Code, Mechanical, and Urban Interface Code. With regard to NFPA, NFPA 101 Life Safety Code, and NFPA 5000 Building Code. I also put in here so you can see the Fire Test Procedures Code that the International Maritime Organization uses. So we're going to be talking about fire. And the key fire test that applies to a very large percentage of industrial fabrics is NFPA 701. NFPA 701 includes two tests, and they're just simply called Test 1 and Test 2. What's the difference? The Test 1 is for fabrics that are under 21 ounces per square yard in aerial density. Test 2 is for ones that are above that. Test 2 also applies every time you have multiple layers in a fabric. Now, you've always often heard about a small-scale NFPA 701 test. That doesn't exist. The small-scale NFPA 701 test was taken out of NFPA 701 in the 1980s. I'm going to say this over and over again 3 or 4 times today in the talk. In the NFPA 701 test 1, you have a pre-mixed flame. You can see on the right the burner, which is perpendicular to the vertical specimen. In test 2, you have a burner more at an angle. It's a diffusion flame in this case. It's a somewhat larger sample, and this is a significantly more severe test. What are details? So this is a vertical textile test, applies to virtually all textiles. And again, as I said, fabrics who claim that they meet NFPA 701 most of the time were tested a small-scale test, which is not included in NFPA 701. It's not a valid test for fire safety. Taken out in the 1980s. But there's a number of textile specs that include the test. Sometimes they don't mention 701. They just mention the test and describe it. Other fire tests, I'm going to start with some that are larger tests. NFPA 289, it's called the furniture calorimeter. It doesn't really mean furniture. It means any big item that you can put onto a load cell and apply a flame to it and measure heat and smoke release. The NFPA 286 and 265 are room corner tests, and I'm going to show you afterwards how that's set up, where you align 3 walls and a ceiling, or just the ceiling, or just 3 walls. ASTM E84 is the standard tunnel test, which is the most famous fire test that we have in the United States, and it doesn't apply to many fabrics, but it does apply to some of them. ASTM E648, the fluorine uranium panel test, applies to carpets, and ASTM E1317 is the IMO surface flame spread test that applies to a lot of things in the marine environment. This is the layout of NFPA 286, also NFPA 265, where you can see it's a room that's 8 foot by 12 foot by 8 foot high, with a burner in the corner. And what you do is you measure the oxygen consumption calorimetry, which gives you the heat release in the duct. You also measure smoke in the duct, and in the room you determine whether you got flashover. Flashover is the moment when everything in the room goes is burning. This is the flame for the NFPA 286 test. It's a very significant flame, and in every one of the room corner tests, you have a burn intensity at the beginning, and then you move on to a larger burn intensity, and it depends on which test. This is the ISO 9705, and what you have is a 300 kilowatt flame. So you see, although the gypsum board that is being tested didn't contribute to anything, you see a very significant flame going all the way to the ceiling. This is the ASTM E84, the standard tunnel test. Each one of those numbers indicates a 1 foot increment from the start. The start is on the left-hand side of the picture, and you see those windows. That's where the operator looks to see where the flame front has progressed. This is what it looks like when it's open, and the ledges are where the specimen is laid on. And this is a picture of the flame. I took this picture from outside the tunnel, of course, and looking down into the tunnel. Flame is so intense that the first 5 feet of anything you put in there get destroyed, whatever it is that you're testing. Going to other tests that are more specific to fabrics or textiles. ASTM D6413 is a vertical flammability test that's used extensively for military uniforms. ASTM D2859 is the methenamine fill test used for carpets. ASTM F2700 is a thermal protective performance TPP test. So you have a hot plate and you determine the effect of that on fabric. F1930, the mannequin test. It's a very intense test with an instrumented mannequin. You apply a very high heat flux. CPI 84 and 75 used to be industrial fabrics tests. They've been copyright has been handed over to ASTM. 75 is the test for sleeping bags. Now it's ASTM F1955. We'll talk a little bit about that later. CPI 84 is for tents, and that is very much undergoing change now. We have to see where we end up with that. ISO 6941 and some other tests are small burner tests are used for a variety of applications. And then we have three specifications, NFPA 1971, 1975, and 1977, and they apply to firefighter clothing. They include a variety of tests in there. These are pictures of some of the equipment. If you start from the left, ASTM E162 is the radiant panel that's used for most transportation here in the United States, for trains underground, also as a voluntary guideline for buses. The one in the middle, the ASTM E1317, the lift or IMO, that's used for that's used for the marine environment. And the one on the right, the ASTM E1354, the cone calorimeter test, I put that in here for simply, although it's rarely used for regulatory purposes, because this is the most important test. If you really want to understand the fire performance of the fabric, you get that from there. It's a small sample, only 4 inches by 4 inches. In the other next set of equipment, you have in the middle the flooring radiant panel. On the left, vertical burner that's used for a number of applications, typical in the FAA. Either the one on the left, the one on the right as well for the FAA. The bottom one is on the left is a smoke chamber used for virtually everything in transportation, including the FAA and railroad. And the one on the right is the Ohio State University heat release rate apparatus used by the FAA primarily. When you talk about fire safety requirements, there are two concepts that you need to understand. If it's regulation like CPSC, then regulation at point of sale. That means that you cannot sell this item unless you have tested it before you sell it. Otherwise, you're doing something illegal. On the other hand, when it's regulated by a code which has then been adopted by a state or something, then it's only regulated at point of use. So you can manufacture anything you want, but if you want to use it in a particular application, then an item has to be assessed before it can be used in a regulated application. There are very few items that are actually regulated by CPSC from the point of view of fire in terms of textiles, and these are the only ones. Apparel textiles by 16 CFR 1610, children's sleepwear, and carpets and rugs, which have two tests, but the one that is a regulatory test is the 1630, 1631. Mattresses, there's the 1632 smoldering, and that's for every component, and 1633 is flaming for the entire mattress, not for components. 1660 CFR 1610 is a very, very mild test, a syringe test. You apply flame from a syringe, basically including tissue paper. You move on 16 CFR 1615 and 16. It's a small burner test for children's sleepwear. We're all the way to 14 years. Both tests have ASTM equivalent tests, and the tests have also been used for a number of other applications. CPSC, as I said before, and I want to keep re-emphasizing this, is the only regulation is at point of sale. But there's no regulation of fabrics for upholstered furniture, protective clothing, most textile, and virtually most consumer products. So there's very few things that you cannot manufacture without having a test before that. From the point of view of transportation, there are several agencies that regulate things, but again, you can manufacture anything you want. It's only when you put it inside the aircraft or inside the highway vehicle or inside a bus or whatever that you have to regulate. FAA regulates aircraft, NHTSA regulates highway vehicles, Federal Transit Administration regulates mass transit, but in fact it has no regulation based on fire safety. It uses the NHTSA requirements. The Federal Railroad Administration regulates trains that go between cities and trains that go between states, but does not regulate trains that are inside a city. Coast Guard regulates ships, but it defers to IMO, the International Maritime Organization for Ships in International Waters. IMO regulates ships worldwide, and if you want to look at passenger trains or underground, it's NFPA 130, which is a voluntary regulation, but in fact, all the authorities in the United States that and Canada, for example, that run trains or underground meet NFPA 130. An interesting thing from the point of view of Coast Guard only regulates those ships that do not go into international waters. That means ships that go into lakes or rivers or just in coastal areas, or the third largest navy in the world, which is the Disney Navy. From the point of view aircraft, the regulation depends on the size of the aircraft. The large commercial aircraft are regulated by the FAR 25, and the small general aviation aircraft are regulated by FAR 23. All the tests are in the Fire Test Handbook, which you can find on the web. It's freely available. And the large commercial aircraft includes the OSU heat release and smoke test. The general aviation aircraft only has small burner fire test. The Marine Organization includes the IMO list for almost everything you can think of, while there are some vertical textiles are assessed by a small German DIN test. But in the marine world, a lot of materials are required to be non-combustible by the ISO international test, the ISO 1182, or of very low combustibility by the ISO 1716, which is the oxygen bomb calorimeter. And note later on I'm going to talk about another non-combustibility test, the one we use in the United States, ASM E136. U.S. Coast Guard, as I said before, regulates ships that don't go into international waters, and it has more requirements. It has either E1317 or E84, the standard tunnel for surface flammability, also uses the NFPA 286 room corner test, but does not use NFPA 265. And here's for the first time we're going to start seeing NFPA 701 for all curtains and drapes as regulated by the Coast Guard. Trains and subways, they usually everything in a train and subway has to meet ASTM E162, the radiant panel, not flooring radiant panel, the other radiant panel, and E662, which is a smoke chamber, except for floor coverings need to meet ASTM E648. Fabrics for if you have to go for upholstery, seats or mattresses, meet ASTM E162 and 662. Everything else is a function purely of the application, not of what the material is. For surface transportation, it's only required for a very mild test, FMVSS 302. That's what NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, requires. And there's no additional fire safety for anything, cars, trucks, anything. Buses have guidelines, no requirements, but the guidelines are very similar to those for subways and trains, and often authorities will try to meet those, but they're not required to do so. An interesting thing is are the school buses. School bus seats are often required to meet a school bus paper bag test, but that is not a federal requirement, and it's not a requirement from the states. It is a requirement from state education authorities. That's a pretty good test. In ASTM, we developed an equivalent test based on a gas burner, and it's been proposed for adoption, ASTM E2574, but as far as I know, it's never been adopted yet. Moving on, the curtains and drapes have to meet NFPA 701, test 1 and test 2. The choice is based on the weight, the aerial density. If it's over 21 ounces per square yard, it's test 2. If it's lower, it's test 1. It's a small burner test, and it is included in every code, International Building Code, International Fire Code, NFPA Life Safety Code, NFPA Building Code. Applies also to all decorative fabrics, but does not apply to fabrics for furniture or mattress. Those are separate issues. Interior finish. What is interior finish? Interior finish is what you use to line the walls and the ceiling, not the floor. The floor is a separate issue. But, and there are 3 tests that are used for interior finish. NFPA 286 and 265, which are the room corner tests. I discussed those before. And ASTM E84, which is a Steiner tunnel. For wall coverings, all 3 tests are acceptable, but the requirements will depend on the application. What kind of category you need to meet and what your requirements are, including, for example, whether you have to sprinkler or don't sprinkler. Passing the requirements based on NFPA 286 always will make the interior finish suitable for any application. Passing the others will depend on where you are. For ceiling coverings, NFPA 265 is not suitable, it's not acceptable, because the flame in NFPA 265 never reaches the ceiling. For floor coverings, you need to meet in the code a combination of ASTM E648, the flooring radiant panel, and ASTM D2859, the methamphetamine pill test. Why did we, NFPA 265, I want to focus on that just for a minute, because it is one that was specifically created for textile wall coverings. However, there are 2 intensities. One is 40 kilowatts and one is 150 kilowatts, and even the high intensity does not reach the ceiling. So NFPA 265 can be used for textile wall coverings or expanded vinyl wall coverings, but cannot be used for any ceiling coverings and for any other material. In fact, because of that, it really isn't used very much anymore. It's mostly been superseded by NFPA 286, which is 40 and 160 kilowatts, and then the flame reaches the ceiling. It's a little bit more severe, but it has a lot more applicability, so pretty much no one tests 265 anymore. One of the things in the past, people used to say, oh, well, carpets are on the floor horizontally. ASTM E84 is a horizontal test, so we should use that for carpets. That's not acceptable anymore. We cannot use E84 for using carpets in interior finish. But there is a section on carpets in ASTM 84, and that is only for research people who want to see how their fabrics work, but they can't put that into the code. Sorry, I went too far. In the IBC and partially in the IFC, there are a number of applications for textiles, and I'm going to run through a lot of them. First one is membrane structures. The IBC has 3 requirements depending on where it is and what the exact requirements are. One is that they be non-combustible, meeting ASTM E136. One is that they be sort of semi-non-combustible, and that's sort of meeting the requirements IBC section 703.5.2. That means that they have to have a non-combustible base and a cover that is meets the ASTM E84 flame strength index of 50. That's sort of gypsum board. This was designed specifically for gypsum board. Or they have to meet NFPA 71 test 1 or 2 as appropriate. Awnings and canopy covers, again, there's 2 options. ASTM E84 flame strength index of 25 or less, or NFPA 701 test 1 or test 2. But if we're talking about awnings and canopy covers in 1 and 2 family dwellings, you can do whatever you want. No fire test is required. This is an interesting application that is growing in popularity, and there are more and more requirements coming down the pipe. It's included both in the International Building Code and in the NFPA requirements. Children's play structures, and children's play structures often have industrial fabrics in there. They could also be covering foam balls or whatever, and all of those have to meet NFPA 701 test 1 or test 2, depending on, as usual, on the weight. There's also in a number of malls, there's kiosks in there, and every fabric in kiosks and malls has to meet NFPA 701 test 1 or test 2 as applicable. Decorations, again, they're covered by the fire code or the life safety code, and they all have to be tested. Typically, it's NFPA 701. recently there's been authorized permission to use NFPA 289, that's the furniture calorimeter, although rarely people will do that. It's a much better test, but it tends to be more severe, more expensive, so people don't do that. But here's one of the examples where we see all the time people who have provide materials that are tested to NFPA 701, but when you look at it, it's the NFPA small scale test, which as I said before, I keep repeating, it doesn't exist anymore. It gives misleading results, so we took it out of 701. Another application that's on the International Fire Code is motion picture screens. They need to meet NFPA 701. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about tents. Tents tend to be required to be tested to CPAI 84, which was a test that was copyrighted by Industrial Fabrics, but Industrial Fabrics transferred jurisdiction to ASTM. If you read CPA 84, the latest edition that exists, which is pretty old, there are two tests in there. It doesn't reference anything else, but it describes the test. And one of the tests is very similar to the ASTM D2859, the methamphetamine pill test, and that applies to the flooring in the carpet. And there's one test that looks very similar to an NFPA 701 small scale for walls and ceilings. This needs significant updating. I don't know whether that's going to happen in ASTM F822, that's the Camping Soft Goods Subcommittee, or ASTM D1352, the Textile Flammability Subcommittee, but it's most likely I'm going to be doing it wherever it goes. This work is also probably going to be in conjunction with the Standards Board of Canada. Tents and membrane structures, both in the IFC and in NFPA 101, are covered by 701, but this tends to be only for very large tents, not for the small individual tents that we're talking about for sports and so on. There are a number of states and Canada regulate tents in some ways. 3 states, California, Louisiana, Michigan, regulated by CPAI 84, so they would have to update if we get rid of that and put a new version in there. Massachusetts regulates by NFPA 701, uses the current edition, so not the small scale test, but the test 1 or test 2. New York uses the IFC, so that's 701. And New Jersey is really weird because it uses the CS190-153, which is a test that's 60 years old, and it's just a 16 CFR 1610 test. That is the hypodermic needles test that everything passes. Canada has 2 criteria, ISO 6941 or CPA 84, but they're in the process of updating requirements. Sleeping bags, the test for sleeping bags is ASTM F1955, used to be CPA 75, but we, in ASTM F822, we updated it and created the new edition that just came out this year with a test for burn rate test with a small burner, and it's a pass-fail test. Military uniforms, particularly U.S. Army uniforms, need to meet ASTM D6413. ASTM D6413 is issued by Committee D13. It's required by the U.S. Army. It's a vertical flammability test, a small burner, measures a bunch of stuff: after glow time, after flame time, char length, and melting and dripping. This is really interesting. Melting and dripping is something that we rarely look at in the United States. In Europe, there is a very significant amount of tests that have requirements that materials shall not melt and drip, or particular that they shall not have flaming drips, all that stuff. We have very few tests in the United States where that is there. But in the transportation environment, usually when materials melt and drip, the test is invalid. You have to change test method, or the material can't be used. Protective clothing, almost all the tests on protective clothing start from ASTM Committee F23, which is Committee on Protective Clothing, and I've highlighted three or four of them in here. There's 2 tests that measure thermal protective performance in different ways, TPP. So what you have is a hot plate, a hot surface contact, and you measure the exposure time and the thermal dose that's needed to cause second-degree burn on the skin. No flames. ASTM F1939 is another radiant heat test. Continuous heating to see what happens to the fabric. ASTM F1930, I'll go through that in a little bit more detail later. It's an instrument and mannequin which is exposed to very large heat flux for a short period of time. And ASTM D6413 I just discussed before is a vertical flammability test. The tests on protective clothing for firefighters, we have three specifications for firefighters. NFPA 1971 is for structural firefighters and proximity firefighters. So that's the bulk of the firefighters. 1977 is for wildland firefighters. And 1975 is for station work uniforms for emergency services, which basically means firefighters. They primarily use hot surface contact tests and other non-flaming heating tests, F1060, F1939. They do a little bit of ASTM D6413, but primarily the other two. The most severe tests for fabrics in terms of protective clothing is included in NFPA 2112, which is for industrial personnel that may need to be involved in flash fires. They use ASTM F1930. That's a mannequin which is instrumented and exposed to 84 kilowatts per square meter for 3 seconds. 84 kilowatts per square meter is a very, very high heat flux. I'll show you in the next slide. I'll show you a picture. The protective clothing that you're assessing needs to be tested with underwear for the mannequin. And what the test assesses is the percentage body burn and gives a rating. This predicts the probability of first, second, or third degree burn. Based on an equation which was calculated using actual skin data. This standard also has ASTM D6413 and ASTM F2700 in there. So there's always a battery of tests and everything. This is the mannequin that is used in ASTM F1930. You see that it's a really very severe test, big flames in there. And this mannequin is naked, but in fact, in the actual test, of course, you're exposing a protective fabric, and the mannequin has to have underwear under the protective fabric so you can see what effect there is on the skin of the mannequin. Something that is growing in popularity and is there's more and more in there throughout the codes now is play structures and inflatable rides. Play structures for children. You can find these often in places like McDonald's, in places like malls, in places like airports, and the kids climb up and down, and there are now requirements in the codes, both in IFC and in the IBC and in NFPA, and all the fabrics have to meet NFPA 701 test too. There's an ASTM specification for other things that they have to meet other than fire, but ASTM F1918 has no fire requirements. Fire requirements are in the code. There's a committee, ASTM F24, that works on standard for inflatable rides, and everything that has a textile, for example, textiles covering foams, etc., the test required there is NFPA 701. And I think pretty much we've come to the conclusion. There are very few mandatory fire regulations at the federal level. There are regulations from transportation agencies, which are, as I explained before, at point of application, point of use, and not on point of sale. Most of the requirements included in the codes, particularly in IFC and NFPA 101, always for application. The most common fire test used is NFPA 701, but not NFPA 701. Small scale, and there's a huge variety of fire tests and requirements. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Marcelo. We do have a number of questions here, and we've also put up here on our final slide a way to contact yourself as well as Jonathan Curry with the IFAI. And then Haskell Beckham will be back next time to be moderating our next webinar on February 23rd, which I think everybody should try to check in on. We will be sending out information about registering for that shortly, so stay tuned for that. Marcelo, you got time for a few questions?
Absolutely.
Sure. So let's start with the first question. What is the IBC?
International Building Code. That's the building code issued by the International Code Council.
Right, and this code is basically adopted just about everywhere across the entire country now. Is that correct?
All 50 states adopt the IBC. Not statewide in every one of the states, but at least some jurisdiction in every one of the states adopts the IBC.
Got it. Great. There's also a question about textile safety gloves or coated safety gloves. Are you aware of what fire retardancy standard safety gloves would be tested to?
A lot of them would be included in, for example, NFPA 2112, which is the one that we, and the ones for firefighters would be included in the respective test for firefighters. So
got it. Great. Here's one that may take a slightly longer answer, but has piqued some interest. Is why? Do you mind just delving in a little bit more about what happened to NFPA 701, the small scale test, why the results were misleading, kind of how you guys figured that out, and when it was phased out, and think just a little bit more details on that, if you can.
Sure. It was phased out in the 1980s. When the 1989, I think the 1989 edition already didn't have it in there. And what happened is we saw that fabrics met 701 small scale, and then were producing really massive fires when this was expanded to a larger scale. So research programs were developed to look at correlation between NFPA 701 small scale and large scale fires, and including room corner tests and so on, and the results were a disaster. So the ATMI developed, I think it's a Textile Manufacturers Institute, something like that. They developed what is now NFPA 701 Test 1, and Test 2 is the same one that was there before. Test 1 was developed by ATMI, and that was much more representative of the fire performance of fabrics, and much more predictive of what would happen in full scale.
Great, fantastic. I appreciate that. We're getting a lot more really good questions coming in here, so I'm going to go ahead and ask them, and if you can answer, that's great, and if not, any comments you have would be wonderful. How is California Proposition 65 affecting flame retardant textiles in general? If you know, is it causing a disruption at all?
I don't think Prop 65 affects this. I mean, because there have been materials included in Prop 65 forever, and that hasn't really affected anything. What is affecting, there is a significant amount of opposition in California to using flame retardants, and we've had 2 sets of regulations that came out, neither of which really affect industrial fabrics, but I'll go through that. The first one dealt with upholstered furniture, and we used to have a test here in California, California TB 117, which was developed in the early 1970s, which was the test to require a open flame test for the paddings included in furniture, and that test was widely used throughout the country. Then after in the early 2000s, actually in 2002, there was a movement afoot to improve the test from what it was originally developed in the 1970s to what was called California TB 117 Plus, but there was heavy push from the industry, from the furniture industry, and that never went into effect. Then in 2013, the governor called the Bureau, whatever the Bureau is called. The Bureau keeps changing names. It used to be the Bureau of Home Furnishings. It changed name several times, and asked them to develop something that permits the same type of fire safety, but without requiring the use of flame retardants. And so what the Bureau did is eliminate the open flame test and just have a smoldering test for furniture. So California TV 117/2013 only has a smoldering test, no open flame test at all for furniture. That is one aspect. The other aspect is the aspect of OA foams. In late 2013, the governor issued another, well, actually, legislature issued a law that was then signed by the governor, recommending that the California State Fire Marshal develop fire tests that could be used for insulation materials without needing necessarily flame retardants. In fact, I participated in these meetings. We had meetings for over a year and developed a number of tests. But at the end of the day, the conclusion was that there was no way to provide the same level of fire safety without using flame retardant materials. So nothing has changed in that regard. So going back to furniture now there's another law that came out, and I can't remember the number of the law, but so all furniture is not required not to have flame retardants. It is not required to have flame retardants, but there's no ban on them. But if you put flame retardants in your furniture, then you have to label it as containing flame retardants. Unfortunately, that law was written very badly, and in fact, furniture manufacturers have figured out that they have to put the label that they have flame retardants even if they don't, because otherwise they may be in conflict with the labeling requirement.
Thank you very much. That's great. For those of us outside of California, not to belabor it, but do you have just a quick summary of what California Proposition 65 is?
California Prop 65 is a list of chemicals that are supposedly carcinogenic or some other, well, primarily carcinogenic, because that they will affect the various health issues. And California Prop 65 labels, you'll find them everywhere, for example, gas stations, and there's a bunch of places. So it's basically more a warning than anything else. It's not something you are allowed to use. Every gas station will have gasoline, and among the gasoline components, there are a number of them which are carcinogenic. So you can't prohibit people from using gasoline, but there's a sign saying it is known by the state, or it is expected by the state, that some of the chemicals that are in use in this facility will be carcinogenic. Okay.
Got it. Fantastic. Thank you. Sticking with, excuse me, California for a few more, for another question. We had a question about California Title 19 for exposure. I'm not sure if you can speak about this or not, but the question was is if you could speak about the outgassing requirements from that title and how that's affected flame retardants.
I don't remember that there's anything there. What I do remember is in California Title 19, there's requirements for tents. There's requirements for additives for Christmas trees when you try to put Christmas trees to make them more fire safe. And in fact, we're working in ASTM E5 on developing a test to assess those. And there is a requirement for fire retardant fabrics. I don't remember the requirements for outgassing. I'm not familiar.
Okay, great. No, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Got a couple more good ones here. We have, excuse me, one manufacturer who manufactures a component trim for PPE. do they have to use NFPA 2112, or would that be NFPA 1971 to sell to customers?
Depends on what the application is. I mean, and that will have to. I haven't studied either one of those in detail, but the 2112 will be the one that will go for industrial application, and 1971 is for firefighter. And you'd have to go through in detail. I mean, it's this question you want to ask me, we can go through it, and I'll have to go in detail. I don't know. But there are different applications. So 1971 is for firefighters, 2112 is for industrial applications.
Yeah, so if the end customer is going to then test the entire garment to 2112, then they would want to then test their component to for their trim component to 2112 as well, and vice versa. Of course, if the end garment was going to be tested to 1971 for firefighter protective gear, then they would want to test that to 1971.
Andrew, what I'm saying is, and I don't remember the details. I mean, I haven't studied that in that great depth. If you go into both of those standards, you'll find that there are individual tests in there. I brought out the bulk of the information, but they're individual tests. So not everything has to be tested or everything. Okay, so both 1971 and 2112 have multiple fire tests in there.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Here's one that I think you'll be familiar with. What is the difference between NFPA 701 and ASTM D6413? Are there any differences?
I could try to go into detail, but the 701 is intended for curtains and drapes and 6413 is intended for uniforms. They are both vertical tests. I think 701 is a more severe test, but 6413 does not have any requirement that is deals with the different weights of the fabric, and it was particularly invented for by the U.S. Army at Natick, Mass. For uniforms. If the caller wants to discuss in great detail, we can go through both and go side by side. But overall, 701 is more severe.
Okay, great, appreciate it. Sticking with our NFPA 701 talk, can you speak to any differences between NFPA 701 and the Canadian standard ULC S109?
I'm not sure. No, I can't. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry to spring that one on you. I realized that one wasn't in your talk, but okay, appreciate it. Looks like we had one more come in, and the question is back to Prop 65 warning, and it says, are you required to have Prop 65 warning even if you have a very, very small percentage of FR materials inside your product? You know, even if it's less than 0.5% by weight, is there a
I don't know. I don't
threshold to it? Okay. And then here is another question about furniture. And so, why did furniture manufacturers conclude that they need to claim the presence of flame retardants for the state of California?
The law, and I don't know the exact wording, the labeling law has been worded in such a way that it talks about additives, I understand the way that the legal departments of different furniture manufacturers have been looking at that. They thought that it is too dangerous to say that you don't have anything, there's a flame retardant, because some things might be considered flame retardants even though they don't have a particular flame retardant effect, like, for example, titanium dioxide or calcium carbonate or things like that, or aluminum trihydrate. We don't know. I mean, were they put in there at 1% or something because in order to improve fire performance, or were they put in there for other reasons? Who knows whether they're there, they're not there, etc. And they can't they can't be sure exactly what the formulation is of every foam and every fabric in there, and barriers and whatever. So it's just safer to say we have something. That way they can't be sued for that.
Understood. Great. Next question. Is there a time frame for the conclusion of CPAI 84 review?
No. We've had a number of conference calls, and as far as I know, there is no conclusion yet as to where it's going to happen, whether the test is going to be developed in ASTM F822 or in D1352, and we'll find out. There is no. You can never put a closing date on any activity that happens at ASTM because it's a consensus standard, so you have to deal with all the negatives, all the comments that come in and address them and work on them and get to where it goes. But the first thing that was discussed at the conference calls that we were involved with was where are we going? What type of tests are we going to do? My preference would be looking at what the tests are that are in there, that just reference the test without having to repeat them in there, because if you repeat them in there, there's a very large likelihood that eventually they'll diverge. Something is there and something is in the original test. So we'll have to see. The key thing is what test are we going to put for the walls and ceilings. For the floor, it's easy. It's the methenamine fill test. For floors and ceiling, there's a big debate there.
Okay, great. No, I appreciate all that insight. We still got some more questions rolling in, so I appreciate it. What kind of restriction or reporting requirements can you think of related to the use of PVC in home textiles?
Don't think there's any restriction as far as I know.
Right.
I mean, I don't know of any restrictions or for using PVCs.
Great, appreciate it. And then this may be our final one. Has California established how they will test and or check for flame retardants in furniture that claims to not have flame retardants present?
I don't think they've got there. No, is the simple answer. And no, they haven't decided anything. Since there seems to be more interest in furniture, and I expect it to be, just want to point out that there is activity going on in furniture at NFPA. NFPA is developing a new test, open flame test for furniture. It's going to be called NFPA 277. We don't know the details yet, but both NIST and NFPA are working on that, and it is likely to be a larger scale test because the opinion is that very small scale is probably not sufficient to address the problems that we have in terms of open flame ignition.
So you think it might be something larger, like in a calorimeter type size?
Well, we have to see. The problem is that we already have a test in a calorimeter, in ASTM E1537 or California TB 133, but the idea is to do something that is simple and that could be run by manufacturers without having a calorimeter. So doing the same thing with a mass loss test. What it was found a few years ago looking at furniture was that mass loss is a good predictor of heat release, and it's much cheaper. You don't need all the oxygen consumption equipment, all that stuff. So my bet is that that's the direction they're going to go, but right now it's still very controversial, but something will come out eventually.
Okay, great, appreciate it. Did have another one come in regarding regulating electrical shielding fabrics. Excuse me, I'm not sure if you know anything about this, but do you know if there are regulations for electrical shielding fabrics?
That would be a function of the application. What's the application that they're talking about? I mean, for where? Because
yeah, Yeah, unfortunately, that's the only information I was given, and so I would encourage the writer to go ahead and reach out to you, Marcelo.
Yeah.
And this is probably a good time too. Dr. Hirschler is more than happy to. He's got his phone number up there and email, and he's more than happy to take phone calls. So feel free to call him anytime to discuss these things. And I think that's all the questions we have, and we've got a few more minutes here. So I'm gonna pass it on over to Jonathan Curry to answer a few questions about the webinar in general, and let him go from here.
Yeah, on behalf of IFAI staff and the Advanced Textiles Product Division, I'd like to thank everybody who attended the third installment of our FR webinar series today. Mark your calendars for the February 23rd webinar that'll be coming up on testing textiles for fire retardancy. You should receive an email alert when registration opens for that. Also, we did receive a number of questions from participants in regards to receiving copies of the slides. Each of the participants today will receive an email with a link to download the PDF for those to receive those slides. So on behalf of Andrew and myself, I'd like to thank Dr. Hirschler again for running a great webinar today, and thank Andrew for moderating. And I really appreciate everybody who attended.
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan. So with that, that'll end today's webinar, and I hope to see many of you back here on February 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and happy holidays.
Bye.